One man. That's how many people survived. In January 1842, Britain sent 16,500 soldiers into Afghanistan. 6 days later, one man rode into the garrison at Jalalabad, Dr. William Brydon, wounded, alone. The rest were dead. Now here's what makes this strange. The British Empire at that moment ruled a quarter of the planet. They had the largest navy on Earth, industrial weapons, professional officers, and they sent one man home. The British came back, twice. Same result. Then the Soviet Union tried. 100,000 troops. 9 years. They left too. Then the United States. $2.3 trillion. 20 years. August 30th, 2021. Last American plane lifts off from Kabul. The same group that was in power in 2001 was back in power within hours. 4 empires. Same patch of mountains. So what is happening here? Because the obvious answer, Afghans are just great fighters, doesn't hold up. Alexander the Great won every pitched battle he fought in the region. The British won most of theirs. The Soviets had tanks and helicopter gunships. This isn't a story about military strength. It's a story about 3 things that no army has found a way to defeat. The first one is a mountain. The Hindu Kush runs 800 kilometers through the center of Afghanistan. The main passes sit between 3,000 and 4,800 meters above sea level. For comparison, Mont Blanc, the highest peak in the Alps, is 4,808 meters. The Khyber Pass, the main entry from Pakistan, is 45 kilometers of switchbacks, cliffs on both sides. Any army moving through it is visible for hours before it arrives. In January 1842, the retreating British column entered those passes in -20 cold. Afghan fighters on the ridges above simply waited. They didn't need to charge. They didn't need artillery. They fired down into a canyon at a target that couldn't scatter and couldn't advance. 6 days. 16,499 people. The terrain didn't create the defeat. It made the defeat geometrically unavoidable. But here's where it gets more complicated. The Soviet Union knew about the passes. They had satellite imagery. They brought helicopters specifically to bypass ground ambushes, and for the first 3 years, those helicopters worked. Then, in 1986, the CIA delivered the first Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen, shoulder-fired, heat-seeking, effective up to 4,800 meters, the same altitude as those mountain passes. Within months, Soviet helicopter losses became unsustainable. The Mi-24 gunship that had been the key weapon of the campaign suddenly couldn't operate safely below 5,000 meters. Geography hadn't changed. The geometry of the problem had. 15,000 Soviet soldiers died in 9 years. That's more American casualties than the entire Vietnam War in roughly half the time. General Boris Gromov was the last Soviet soldier to leave. February 15th, 1989. He walked across the Friendship Bridge alone, on purpose. It was a statement. The war is over. We lost. But the terrain is only the first layer. The second is harder to see on a map. In Pashtun culture, there is a concept called badal. It translates roughly as revenge, but that's too simple. It's closer to balance. If someone wrongs your family, restoring the balance is not an option. It is an obligation. Not this year. Not if it's convenient. Across generations, if necessary. Now picture what happens when a foreign army burns a village. Under Western military logic, collective punishment breaks morale. The population stops supporting the insurgency to avoid more destruction. Under Pashtunwali, burning the village created a debt that every man in that village was now obligated to repay. Not against the individuals who did it, against everyone who came from the same place they came from. The British burned over 100 villages in the First Anglo-Afghan War. Each one added fighters to the resistance faster than casualties removed them. The Soviets razed more than 2,000 villages between 1979 and 1989. Same result, larger scale. There's a phrase that appears in British intelligence reports from the 1840s, Soviet military assessments from the 1980s, and U.S. counterinsurgency papers from the 2000s, almost word for word. Enemy regenerates faster than we can degrade it. Different century, same sentence. And here's what connects the terrain to the culture. When your enemy can scatter into mountains and valleys you don't control, and when harming civilians creates more enemies than it eliminates, attrition stops working. The army that came to win keeps winning battles. The country that came to outlast just has to wait. And waiting is something Afghanistan has always been extraordinarily good at. Which brings us to the third thing, the one that almost no one talks about, Kabul. Every empire that invaded Afghanistan captured Kabul within weeks, and immediately discovered that holding Kabul did not mean holding Afghanistan, because Afghanistan isn't organized around a capital, it's organized around valleys. A commander who controls the Panjshir Valley north of Kabul answers to his tribe and his fighters, not to whoever is sitting in the presidential palace. This isn't chaos. It's a different kind of order, one that functions perfectly well without a central government and has done so for centuries. Every occupier tried to build a modern, centralized state on top of that structure. The British installed Shah Shuja as ruler in 1839. He was assassinated in 1842. The Soviets backed Najibullah. His government survived 3 years after Soviet withdrawal, then collapsed in a day. The U.S. spent $88 billion training the Afghan National Army. That's more than NASA's entire budget for the same period. When the Taliban advanced in August 2021, that army mostly disbanded without significant resistance, not cowardice, a rational calculation. Why die for a government in Kabul that your tribe didn't elect, doesn't represent you, and will probably collapse when the Americans leave anyway? The structure that made Afghanistan ungovernable to outsiders is the same structure that made it survivable to the people who live there. Decentralized, resilient, impossible to behead because there's no single head. Now, before you walk away with "Afghanistan always wins," let's complicate that. The Mughal Empire controlled most of Afghanistan from the 16th century onward without this kind of catastrophic failure, because Mughal rulers governed through existing tribal structures rather than replacing them. They spoke the local language. They married local women. They taxed and left the internal order intact. Ahmad Shah Durrani, who founded one of the largest empires in 18th century Asia in 1747, was Pashtun. He didn't conquer Afghanistan, he organized it from the inside. The pattern isn't Afghanistan defeats everyone. The pattern is more specific. Afghanistan defeats every outside force that tries to run it like it's somewhere else. Every army that failed brought a template from home and tried to paste it onto a place that had been doing things its own way for 2,500 years. And the mountains, the Badal, the decentralized order, all three made sure the paste never held. There's one number that cuts through all of this better than any analysis. The United States spent $300 million per day in Afghanistan for 20 years. $300 million is enough to build a full university campus every single day. At the end of those 20 years, the Taliban controlled more territory than they did on September 12, 2001. The money didn't lose. The strategy lost. The same strategy that lost in 1842 and in 1989. Here is the thing about Afghanistan that nobody wanted to hear, and that history has been screaming for 2.5 millennia. You can hold Kabul. You cannot hold Afghanistan. These are not the same thing, and every empire spent years learning the difference. Alexander figured it out after 3 years and a political marriage. Britain figured it out after 3 wars and 80 years. The Soviet Union figured it out after 15,000 body bags. The United States figured it out after $2.3 trillion. The lesson was always available. It was written in the mountains, written in the culture, written in the way the country is structured. Nobody read it before they arrived. And now, here's the part that should make you stop. Right now, in 2024, at least 4 major powers are competing for influence in Afghanistan. China is investing in infrastructure. Russia is holding diplomatic talks. Pakistan and Iran are playing their own angles. None of them have sent armies. Maybe they read the book. Maybe they just watched what happened to everyone else. Either way, the mountains are still there. The Khyber Pass is still there. The tribal structures are still there. And the country that outlasted Alexander, Victoria, Brezhnev, and Biden is still there too. Not because it's undefeatable, because it's unholdable. And that, it turns out, is enough.